Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to join us tonight. We have a full program, so we're going to get started now. Before I introduce two illustrative historians, I want to tell you a little bit about Peace Action New York State. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with it, but some of you are new to our organization. Today's Peace Action is the outgrowth of two American organizations dedicated to making the world free of nuclear weapons. SANE was founded in 1957 and headed by Norman Cousins and Clarence Pickett. They brought together luminaries such as Dr. Benjamin Spock, Professor Seymour Melman, and celebrities to focus American public opinion on the dangers of nuclear weapons. It was instrumental in negotiating the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963. The Freeze, on the other hand, was a grassroots campaign that arose in 1979 through the efforts of Randy Forsberg. It called for the US and the Soviet Union to agree to halt the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, and sponsored the 1982 anti-nuclear demonstration in Central Park with nearly 1 million participants. These two storied organizations merged in 1987 as SANE Freeze, and in 1993 adopted the name Peace Action under the leadership of the Reverend William Sloane Coffin Jr. PANYS, Peace Action New York State, is a member of the National Peace Action family. We have chapters throughout the state, chapters and affiliates. But being a part of a national organization means that we can bring their expertise in lobbying, in insider information on what is happening in Washington, what is not happening in Washington, and give that information, energy, and advice to our local chapters. Now, this year, 2024, is an especially important year for us because it's a presidential election year. And we know, because all of us are being inundated with requests for funding and donations from various organizations, including the candidates themselves. The other big issue, of course, is the immediate issue is the horrors of the war in Gaza. Why give to PANYS when there are so many other organizations, candidates, and organizations directly working on Gaza, for instance? It's because PANYS is always here. PANYS goes from year to year to year. We don't pop up just on the election year, and it's because we support our affiliates throughout the state that we are able to spring into action when crises emerge. And so tonight we are going to be focusing on history. That's another thing that we do, is that people understand how we got to the point that we are now. But we are also activists, and we need the support of old and young activists to keep us going from year to year. And so we hope that you will be generous with us, and we hope we enjoy the program tonight. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Blanche Wiesen Cook, a distinguished professor and the noted biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Blanche is going to moderate the program tonight and tell us a little bit more about herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. I'm thrilled to be here with so many of you out there. I wish we were all together in a face-to-face, heart-to-heart, but we are face-to-face, heart-to-heart. I'm really thrilled tonight to introduce the work and the spirit of my pal, Larry Wittner. Larry and I, for many years, Larry was president of Peace History Society, which we founded in 1964. I was a student at Johns Hopkins, and my mentor, Charlie Barker, said we have to have a peace movement among historians. We need to deal with our history. And so that was the Conference on Peace Research, which became the Peace History Society, and Larry was president of it. And I have to say, Larry has written some fabulous books, which I would like to, by way of introduction, tell you about, because every one of them is really a thrilling book. In 1969, he did this wonderful book, Rebels Against War, the American Peace Movement, 1941 to 1960. And then he did a book in 1982, American Intervention in Greece, 1943 to 1949, which in so many ways is a book we all need to reread today for a variety of reasons. Maybe you can tell us about that, Larry. And then he edited and introduced a wonderful book on peace action. And this wonderful book came out in 2007, edited by Glenn Harold Stassen and Larry Wittner, with a foreword by Barbara Lee and a great chapter on peace action and its history from sane and freeze to peace action by Larry. And then he did for us a wonderful memoir, Working for Peace and Justice. And this memoir, Working for Peace and Justice, came out in 2012. Working for Peace and Justice, Memoirs of an Activist Intellectual. And he dedicates the book to the many people who have made my heart sing. And I just want to say, Larry's work makes all of us who are activists, makes our heart sing. And finally, in addition to the struggle against the bomb advertised on the video that you just saw, there's a three-volume history, The Struggle Against the Bomb. And the first volume is entitled One World or None. And it's a history of the world nuclear disarmament movement through 1953. And there's something about one world or none which resonates today in such a powerful way. Wendell Willkie Presente, we are all united. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody, everywhere. And now in this new moment of escalation and new returns to the military industrial complex and new weapons that this administration, imagine that, is considering, one world or none. And volume 2 is called Resisting the Bomb, 1954 to 1970. And the third volume is called Towards Nuclear Abolition. And that's where we have to focus on, how do we abolish the nukes? How do we demilitarize? How do we fight for peace and justice and freedom? How do we proceed along the path that will lead us to one world so we can be together as we struggle with climate change and poverty and disaster and famines? So over to you, Larry Wittner, Professor Emerita and past president of the Peace History Society.
Thank you so much, Blanche. I'm delighted to be here and particularly honored by your introduction. since I've always thought so much of your scholarly work and your political work, of course, as well. When I suggested the use of the words, the full story in the title of this talk, I didn't mean to imply that I would tell you everything that happened in connection with campaigns to avert nuclear destruction. That's a very big story and involves the efforts of millions of people over many years. Instead, tonight, I'm going to give you a brief but comprehensive account, after which I'll be glad to field questions. The key thing to know about Oppenheimer is that he was an inside operator. This status gave him an important role in government policymaking, but also meant that, unlike most anti-nuclear activists, he never totally repudiated nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer, after all, was exhilarated by his role as a high-level government official during wartime as the director of the crucial Los Alamos branch of the Manhattan Project, and in the post-war era as the chair of the General Advisory Committee of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. In these capacities, he played a crucial part in the development and production of U.S. nuclear weapons. Also, during the war, when the atomic bombing of Japan was discussed at high government levels, he spoke out in favor of the bomb's use. In fact, when Leo Szilard and other uneasy bomb project scientists petitioned President Truman against using the bomb, Oppenheimer blocked circulation of the petition at Los Alamos. Yes, after World War II, Oppenheimer felt qualms about the atomic bombing. Also, he warned against the dangers of the post-war nuclear arms race, and like many scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, sought international nuclear arms controls. Furthermore, in his role with the General Advisory Committee of the AEC, he argued against producing the far more destructive H-bomb. However, as an alternative, he championed maintaining an arsenal of atomic bombs. And he continued, while he could, his role in the U.S. nuclear weapons program. By contrast, Albert Einstein was a type that is more familiar in the struggle against the bomb, the outsider. Yes, it's true that Einstein, in response to pleas from worried scientists, wrote a letter to President Roosevelt warning about the establishment of a Nazi nuclear weapons program. And this action helped launch the Manhattan Project. But Einstein did not play any role in building the bomb and never advocated using it. Actually, Einstein had long been a sharp critic of war. As a physicist in Germany during World War I, he publicly denounced the German war effort, which nearly landed him in prison. After World War II, he used his fame as a scientist to promote international cooperation and particularly war resistance, arguing that wars would cease when men refused to fight. Only after the Nazi seizure of power in Germany did Einstein reluctantly support collective security among non-fascist nations in the hope that that would prevent Nazi military might from conquering the world. When, after Germany's defeat during World War II, the bomb was employed by the US government to attack Japanese cities, Einstein was horrified. In the aftermath of the atomic bombing, Einstein argued publicly and repeatedly that nuclear weapons would inevitably be used in war, and therefore it was imperative to end war by limiting national sovereignty. Or, as he put it, quote, "The only salvation for civilization and the human race lies in the creation of a world government with security of nations founded upon law." Many scientists of the time, including many who worked on the Manhattan Project, agreed with Einstein on the need for a world federation, or at the very least, an international ban on nuclear weapons. Working together, they formed the Federation of American Scientists, began publishing the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and organized the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists with Einstein as chair. This atomic scientist movement was part of a broader popular uprising around the world against nuclear weapons. In the late 1940s, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sent a wave of public dismay across the globe. Some people were deeply troubled by the mass murder of civilians. Many more, though, feared that the development of nuclear weapons would lead to the destruction of the world. Determined to avert nuclear annihilation, scientist groups and world government organizations sprang up in numerous nations, often employing the slogan that Blanche just mentioned, one world or none. In Japan, the survivors of the bombing held anti-nuclear gatherings, including Hiroshima Day commemoration ceremonies. Although this first surge of anti-nuclear activism faded with the heightening of the Cold War, the escalation of the nuclear arms race, and particularly H-bomb tests, triggered an even more vigorous upsurge of protest in the late 1950s and early 1960s. In a widely publicized appeal, Bertrand Russell and Einstein warned of a nuclear holocaust. Other prominent intellectuals, including Albert Schweitzer and Linus Pauling, followed their example. Through the Pugwash movement, developed by Russell and Joseph Rotblat, scientists on both sides of the Iron Curtain began a series of conferences about the nuclear danger. Ban the Bomb movement sprang up around the globe. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, in Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the National Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, SANE, and Women Strike for Peace in the United States, Gensuikyo and Gensuiken in Japan, the struggle against atomic death in West Germany, and comparable movements in many Western and non-aligned countries. They distributed vast quantities of anti-nuclear material, published chilling advertisements, and staged simultaneous protest marches under the nuclear disarmament symbol in dozens of nations. These anti-nuclear agitators even held demonstrations in communist nations. Meanwhile, opinion polls revealed overwhelming popular distaste for nuclear war and support for abolishing nuclear weapons. The most powerful wave of popular struggle began in the late 1970s, when the Cold War reemerged. In this context, older anti-nuclear groups started to revive and newer ones to appear. By 1980, US peace groups were mobilizing for a nuclear freeze. Meanwhile, West European groups, pulled together by an Appeal for European Nuclear Disarmament, END, were gearing up to oppose the deployment of a new generation of devastating intermediate-range nuclear missiles. This revival turned into mass protests after 1980, spurred on by the advent of the hawkish Reagan administration with its loose talk of nuclear war. END was soon coordinating a huge anti-nuclear campaign in Europe. Groups like CND in Britain, the Interchurch Peace Council in the Netherlands, and People for Nuclear Disarmament in Australia ballooned into mass movements that held vast protest rallies. In the fall of 1983, an estimated 5 million people took part in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Even in the communist nations of East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, China, and the Soviet Union, small independent nuclear disarmament groups emerged and publicly challenged official policy, despite the harassment and imprisonment of activists. In the United States, physicians for social responsibility and SANE grew rapidly. Meanwhile, the nuclear freeze campaign drew the backing of most peace groups, unions, and mainstream religious bodies. Polls found that the freeze had the support of 70 to 80% of the public. Although protests against the bomb waned in the late 1980s, the movement retained substantial strength. Only in the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, did it sharply decline. These three upsurges of mass public protest had a remarkable impact. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, numerous governments interested in building nuclear weapons but battered by anti-nuclear protests decided reluctantly not to develop the bomb. They included the governments of West Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland. The Japanese government, perhaps the most shell-shocked by the popular protests, issued a proclamation of three non-nuclear principles: a refusal to manufacture, possess, or introduce nuclear weapons into Japan. The Canadian government moved to phase nuclear weapons out of its national defense program. In response to anti-nuclear agitation in later years, there were also important shifts in other lands. New Zealand banned visits of nuclear warships. Australia refused to test MX missiles. India halted work on nuclear weapons. The Philippines adopted a nuclear-free constitution. South Africa scrapped its nuclear weapons program. These waves of protest certainly had a significant impact in the United States. The Truman administration began with a very positive view of weapons and with no plans for nuclear arms controls. And yet, under intense public pressure, the president came around to authorizing the development of the Baruch Plan, the world's first serious nuclear disarmament proposal. Similarly, when the Eisenhower administration came to office in 1953, it too had no interest whatsoever in disarmament. Nuclear weapons, the president declared publicly, should, quote, be used just exactly as you would use a bullet or anything else. But H-bomb tests unleashed such a torrent of protest that US officials were forced to consider a nuclear test ban. As Secretary of State John Foster Dulles conceded, there had developed, quote, a popular and diplomatic pressure for limitation of armaments that cannot be resisted by the United States without forfeiting the goodwill of our allies and the support of a large part of our own people. By the late 1950s, US action had become a political necessity. In 1957, responding to a sales pitch for continued nuclear testing, Eisenhower retorted that, quote, we are up against an extremely difficult world opinion situation, unquote. And the US government could not, quote, permit itself, as he said, to be crucified on a cross of atoms. When in March 1958, the Soviet government halted nuclear testing, Washington was on the spot. Nuclear testing was not evil, Eisenhower complained, but, quote, people have been brought to believe that it is. The result was a voluntary moratorium on nuclear testing by the US, British, and Soviet governments. Even when the Russians renewed nuclear tests in the fall of 1961, the US government remained hesitant, delaying atmospheric testing until April 1962. It also now went to unprecedented lengths to secure a test ban treaty. That November, President Kennedy met with Norman Cousins, the co-chair of SANE, and urged Cousins to convince Soviet Premier Khrushchev of his, Kennedy's sincerity in seeking a nuclear test ban. Cousins began shuttling between the two world leaders, and in the spring of 1963, finally persuaded both men that the time was ripe for action. US, British, and Soviet officials signed an atmospheric test ban treaty that summer. In retrospect, Kennedy administration officials have agreed that it was public pressure that produced this first nuclear arms control treaty. The movement's effectiveness is underscored by its impact on the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan had opposed every nuclear arms control measure negotiated by Democratic or Republican presidents, and his national security officials were drawn from the ultra-hawkish Committee on the Present Danger. The policy of these Reaganites was to sponsor a vast U.S. nuclear buildup. But in response to popular protests, they made important shifts in U.S. policy. Pressured by beleaguered West European government leaders, the Reagan administration proposed foregoing any installation of U.S. intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe if the Russians would remove all of theirs. This offer was not a serious one and was designed to dampen public protest. Meanwhile, the administration began deploying the missiles. However, amid massive public protests, Reagan grew seriously rattled. In October 1983, he told his startled Secretary of State, quote, "If things get hotter and hotter and arms control remains an issue, maybe I should go see Premier Yuri Andropov, Soviet premier, and propose eliminating all nuclear weapons." Secretary of State George Shultz was horrified by this idea, but Shultz agreed that, quote, "we could not leave matters as they stood." In January 1984, Reagan himself delivered a remarkable public address calling for peace with the Soviet Union and for a nuclear weapons-free world. Once Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in March 1985, the way was open for action. Gorbachev was not only a true believer in nuclear disarmament, but a movement convert. The Soviet leader's new thinking, as he called it, by which he meant the necessity for peace and disarmament in the nuclear age, came from a well-known anti-nuclear statement by Einstein in 1946, reiterated in the Russell-Einstein Appeal of 1955. Gorbachev's advisors pointed to the powerful influence on Gorbachev of the Western nuclear disarmament movement, as did Gorbachev himself. When Gorbachev called the U.S. bluff by agreeing to remove all intermediate-range missiles from Europe, this action dismayed NATO's hawks, who didn't want it. But one administration official recalled, "We had to take yes for an answer." Thus, in late 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, removing all intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe. Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, frightened by the prospect of a revival of popular protests, went on to withdraw U.S. short-range nuclear missiles from Western Europe unilaterally. The impact of peace activists on nuclear testing was even more direct. Since the mid-1980s, disarmament groups around the world worked to end underground nuclear weapons explosions. Large demonstrations forced the Soviet and U.S. governments to shut down their nuclear testing programs. Finally, in September 1996, representatives of countries from around the world celebrated the signing of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Speaking at the UN ceremonies, U.S. Ambassador Madeleine Albright declared, quote, "This was a treaty sought by ordinary people everywhere. And today, the power of that universal wish could not be denied." Popular pressure also constrained government leaders from using the bomb. In 1956, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at the time, complained that the atomic bomb had acquired, quote, "a bad name, and to such an extent that it seriously inhibits us from using it." Indeed, later that year, when some administration officials called for greater flexibility in the employment of nuclear weapons, Eisenhower retorted, quote, "The use of nuclear weapons would raise serious political problems in view of the current state of world opinion." Similarly, when it came to the Vietnam War, the Kennedy administration found nuclear war politically impossible. McGeorge Bundy, who served as U.S. National Security Advisor during most of the 1960s, maintained that the U.S. government's decision not to use nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War did not result from fear of nuclear retaliation, but from the terrible public reaction that a U.S. nuclear attack would provoke in other nations. Even more significant, Bundy maintained, was the prospect of public upheaval in the United States. For, as Bundy said, quote, "No president could hope for understanding and support from his own countrymen if he used the bomb." This nuclear taboo seemed to dissipate with the advent of the Reagan administration, whose top national security officials entered office talking of fighting and winning a nuclear war. But this position quickly changed as the administration came to recognize that its glib militarist talk was a political disaster. Starting in April 1982, Reagan began declaring publicly that, quote, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." He added, quote, "To those who protest against nuclear war, I can only say, I'm with you." Although this brief history reveals that popular pressure played a crucial role in curbing the nuclear arms race and preventing nuclear war, such pressure also had its limits. For example, it never succeeded in abolishing all nuclear weapons, nearly 13,000 of which remain in existence today. Furthermore, mass protest movements are difficult to sustain. In recent decades, the anti-nuclear campaign has dwindled, and not surprisingly, the nuclear situation has grown more ominous. The number of nuclear powers is increased to 9. Nearly all nuclear arms control and disarmament treaties have been scrapped, and national leaders like Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and Vladimir Putin have repeatedly issued public threats of nuclear war. Currently, in fact, all the nuclear powers, all 9 of them, are engaged in a massive, vastly expensive nuclear weapons buildup that is designed to produce a new, more accurate, more devastating generation of nuclear weapons. The doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has been set at 90 seconds to midnight, the most dangerous setting in its history. This revival of the nuclear menace reflects not only the dwindling of public pressure for nuclear disarmament, but a failure to come to grips adequately with the driving force of the nuclear arms race, the conflict among nations that throughout history has generated armaments and wars. As Einstein and many of his fellow scientists understood in 1945, in a world of independent, feuding countries, national governments seek to acquire the most powerful weapons available to secure what they view as their national interest. Consequently, I believe that ending the threat of nuclear destruction necessitates a 2-part approach. The first part entails rebuilding a mass movement that rejects nuclear weapons. The second part entails building a stronger system of global governance, capable of guaranteeing international security. This means a world federation of nations, perhaps in the form of a stronger United Nations, that while leaving national concerns to national governments, will have the responsibility and the power to cope with international concerns, thus creating international security. Many things have changed since the atomic bombings of 1945, but the fundamental choice remains, and that is one world or none. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take questions.
Thank you very much for that, Larry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're going to have a discussion now between Larry and Blanche, and in the meantime, and after that, we will take questions from the audience. So we're not going to do it by audio. If people would put their questions in the chat, and after the discussion between Blanche and Larry, we will look at those questions. Thanks very much.
Larry, that was so powerful and so important. We just really, I like your ending that we need a two-part approach to go forward. We need to rebuild what was once a vigorous and powerful and popular movement. And we need to contemplate a stronger system of international, we need to empower the United Nations, is really what has to happen. The first part raises lots of questions for me, and only you can answer them fully. But one thing I want to say is Claire and I met during the war in Vietnam as members of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we were protesting together, and we marched together, and we organized together. And the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is now celebrating, it's a global movement, it's all over the world, and it's celebrating its 111th year, 111 years for WILF. So, hey, we need all of these movements. So one question I have, what are the constituencies that you would contemplate going to rebuilding? Why doesn't peace action, how can peace action have a network, create a network so that we're all moving together, shoulder to shoulder? And I know Sally's going to Washington with a network to protest next week, or maybe not next week, maybe this week. How do we do it? What are your thoughts, Larry?
Well, I'm not sure how to do it, but I'll be glad to suggest some of the key constituencies of the past, which I think remain key constituencies for an anti-nuclear movement. Obviously, anyone we can draw to that campaign we should work on. But I think generally speaking, the peace movement, and particularly the anti-nuclear movement, has drawn on the educated middle class, particularly the helping professions, as they're sometimes called, teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers, librarians, and others who really formed a disproportionate part, were overrepresented in many ways in the peace movement, and particularly in the anti-nuclear crusade. Other constituencies would be the women's movement, mainline religious groups. Unfortunately, fundamentalist religious groups have never been sympathetic, or for the most part haven't been sympathetic to the anti-nuclear cause. But other mainline churches and religious groups have been, and so I think that religious bodies can be drawn on. The women's movement, though, is certainly one that's played a very significant role in the past, and I think could play it in the future. In addition to WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, there were groups like Women's Strike for Peace in the United States, or Voice of Women in Canada, or the Swedish Social Democratic Party's women's organization, and other specifically women's groups that played a very significant role. In fact, the Nuclear Freeze campaign was backed by the National Organization for Women in the United States. And there were many great women's leaders in the past. Dagmar Wilson led Women Strike for Peace. Peggy Duff was really the heart and soul of Britain's campaign for nuclear disarmament. Eleanor Roosevelt played a major role, as you know, in the National Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy. And in the later decades, people like Randy Forsberg was there founding the Weapons Freeze campaign, or Helen Caldicott in Physicians for Social Responsibility, or Mary Kaldor in the European nuclear disarmament campaigns. And then, of course, there were the women's peace encampments too. So I think women are have been mobilized and can certainly be mobilized in the future.
I just want to say a word about Sister Megan Rice, who was one of the many Catholic activists arrested over 40 times and who really stormed nuclear power plants and did very naughty things. And she was arrested, and there was some thought that she might spend the rest of her life in jail. And she said, "Don't worry about me spending the rest of my life in prison. I can think of nothing better than to die in prison because of my anti-nuclear work." And there's no biography of Sister Megan Rice for those of you out there looking for a subject. She died in 2021, but what a great legacy the women had. And Vera Brittain in England. Thank you, Larry. That's the first part. The second part, and I just want to say one thing. Peace Action has been doing something really wonderful in our Peace Action group, which is going around to colleges and getting young people involved. And I think that that is really one of the most exciting things that we're doing, and one of the biggest things and best things we're doing. What might we do about the United Nations? What are your thoughts about focusing on changes that need to be made?
Well, I think it's been evident for many years that the United Nations can issue very well-meaning humanitarian statements, but unfortunately, it's often, not all the time, but often crippled when it comes to action, to implementing the programs that it calls for. International Court of Justice, which is part of the UN family, issued a strong statement condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine and called upon the Russians to go back home. But of course, they just shrug their shoulders, and the war goes on. And similarly, in Gaza, where the International Court of Justice issued its ruling, a devastating ruling, when it came to Israeli action, and it called upon Israel to stop what it was doing in Gaza, but the Israeli government simply disregarded it. So we really need a campaign to empower the United Nations, or we can set up some other international body, that body. But I think, given the fact that the United Nations is there, we need to empower the United Nations to do the things that the world community agrees on. And if 100 and some odd countries in the General Assembly vote that the Russians should leave, as they voted, the Russians should leave. And there should be a significant pressure by the United Nations. Now, that means that instead of just complaining about the United Nations weakness, we have to mobilize the public to demand the United Nations action, and to turn aside politicians who, nationalist politicians who scorn international action. And we need politicians who are going to strengthen the United Nations, who are going to support the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, for example, something I can come back to later if you'd like, and can see to it that the nuclear powers sign that damn treaty and get rid of their nuclear weapons. So we need a public mobilization to push politicians toward strengthening the United Nations. One more way the UN could be strengthened, well, two more ways, is one, abolish the Security Council veto. So the Security Council could do what it's supposed to do, maintain international peace and security. And two, we can give the UN the power to institute a tax, about a stock transfer tax, right? All these international stock exchanges exist, and commodity purchases take place, and so on. That money could go to funding the UN. One reason the UN isn't stronger is it doesn't have the ability to tax or raise its own money. It's dependent upon what are really voluntary contributions by the governments of the world. So naturally, the United Nations doesn't want to go out of its way to antagonize the US government or antagonize the Russian government or others that are its major funders. But the great powers can be shoved to the side if the United Nations has sufficient funding on its own. So that's a further way to empower it.
I would like you to go back to the 2017 UN call for nuclear disarmament, which the United States, the United States has not ratified this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the US has still not ratified the Economic and Social Rights Covenant. In addition, the US is not a party to the UN call for nuclear, that 2017 treaty.
Right.
Has, could a few more words about that?
Oh,
Mike?
sure. Well, in purely legal terms, I mean, if the world operated under international law, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons would resolve the nuclear issue that the world faces, the threat of nuclear destruction. This treaty was negotiated in various UN conferences. It was adopted by an overwhelming vote of the participants in the last conference.
122.
122, what was it? Yeah, 122 to 1, I believe, or maybe to 1 abstention. Now, the pro-nuclear powers and the nuclear powers didn't attend those meetings, since they didn't want to see anything come out of that 2017 conference. So they didn't take part. Nonetheless, had they taken part, they would have been tremendously outvoted. So the treaty was adopted then. And then, of course, nations have to decide whether they're going to sign it and whether they're going to ratify it after their executive signs it. Well, since that time, of the 193 or so nations that exist in the world, 93 nations have signed it, and 70 nations have ratified it. And for the treaty to take effect, only 50 nations have to ratify. So it's in effect as of January 2021. So here we have a UN treaty, right, that calls for an end to all nuclear testing, all development of nuclear weapons, all possession of nuclear weapons, threats of nuclear weapons. It's a great treaty from the standpoint of nuclear abolition. But, of course, none of the nuclear powers have signed it. There are 9 nuclear weapons producing powers. Not one of them has signed because they want to hold on to their nukes, and they're not interested in what the United Nations has to say. And in fact, none of the nations that house the nuclear powers' nuclear weapons, such as some NATO nations and some Russian allies too, like Belarus, for example. None of them has signed this treaty. So in short, it's a treaty that's just fine for the nations that don't have nuclear weapons, and they'd rather see the other countries get rid of them too. But to the nations that have the nuclear weapons, they're not planning to get rid of them. So the effort in this country and in other countries too, by a worldwide anti-nuclear campaign, should be to get their governments to make them to sign the treaty, to ratify it, and therefore make themselves parties to this treaty. That is, have themselves bound by the treaty. They're not bound by it now. It's purely up to them as to whether they sign. And unfortunately, that's true of this country, and it's true at this point of most, or somewhat more than half of the nations of the world.
I think that's a good time to look at. The New York Times ran a special 4-page article confronting a new nuclear age by Kathleen Kingsbury, and how we return to the brink by W.J. Hannigan. This ran in the Sunday New York Times of March 10th. It's 4 pages, and it is an incredible synopsis of the scary moment that we're in. We had a great peace movement. We had people really thinking it was over, the nuclear danger, the nuclear threat. But right now, with people like Putin and the unnameable one who might run for president again, you know, there are leaders who are talking about using nuclear weapons in ways that we have not heard for at least 30 years. And it's a very frightful article that also includes just how many nuclear warheads the different nuclear powers have, including, alas, Israel. I don't know if Netanyahu has threatened to use nuclear weapons, but that Israel has nuclear weapons is something we all need to know. Your thoughts, Larry?
Well, it's just to go to your last point, as Israel's nuclear weapons. One reason that the Israeli government acts with impunity, right? Doesn't really care about criticism, it brushes it off, is that it has nuclear weapons, and so it feels that it can do what it wants. It has the big guns there, and it's really not afraid in that sense. It has other fears, of course, but not of what other nations think. And similarly with Putin in Russia, that is, he's deliberately discussed or threatened use of nuclear weapons as a means of shielding himself from greater Western backing for Ukraine. The United States, purely in military terms, could, of course, do a lot more. So could Britain and other major powers, but they're not doing that. At most, they're providing weapons. Even then, Putin threatens nuclear war. But nonetheless, they feel that under this nuclear shield, no one can dare challenge them, and they can frighten other countries off. So it's a kind of nuclear blackmail that can work at times. And if it doesn't work, we can have nuclear war. So it's a very dangerous situation. Let me just say one good thing, since I didn't mention the number of nuclear weapons that were once in existence. The world had 70,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the nuclear arms race of the past. So the fact that we're down to 13,000 shows us that popular pressure, as well as good leadership in a number of countries like Gorbachev's leadership of the Soviet Union, can result in nuclear disarmament. But unfortunately, it hasn't proceeded on to zero, and it started to go the other way the last few years.
But now we know where to start, and we can continue on shoulder to shoulder into the future with a budding and building movement. I also would like to end before Tara gets us other people. There are 34 or 35 people in the chat, questions galore. I want to mention Alice Slater sent me a wonderful article by ICANN folks, From the Manhattan Project to a Nuclear-Free New York City. And it's how New York City banned nuclear weapons and nuclear testing and all things nuclear, so that there would be no nuclear waste in the city. And it's a wonderful article by Matthew Bolton. The International Disarmament Institute put it out, and ICANN was behind it. And so there are really movements that we just need to follow and collect our different important activities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Larry.
No, I just
no.
wondered if
Okay.
Larry had a thought
So,
about
yeah,
that.
Oh,
Go ahead.
well, I think that's great. But I would like to turn to some questions now from the audience. So, Tara?
Yes, there are questions coming in from the audience. And again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. And before we go to the questions, though, I want to make one last appeal for those who have enjoyed this evening's program and who are getting a sense about the value and the importance of the work that PANYS does. And I would urge you to make a donation to PANYS. We do lobby. We do take political positions, so donations are not tax deductible, but they make a big, big difference to us. So you can go to our website. I'm putting the link in the chat now. It's panys.org/support-our-work. And again, I urge you to give whatever you can to support our organization. Now, one of the interesting questions that we have here is coming from Jim Anderson, who in fact is the president of PANYS. And he's asking if you see a relationship between nuclear concerns and immigration, climate, and domestic needs.
I can see two connections. One is, of course, that the vast spending on nuclear weapons or armaments, generally speaking, is taken out of the revenues the government collects, and so there's a channeling of money away from human needs in the United States and other countries too, to building nuclear weapons. The buildup by the United States is estimated to cost anywhere, that is just the nuclear build, mind you, that's underway right now, is estimated to cost anywhere from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. So you put that into into domestic social programs, and you can do a lot in terms of human security right here at home and in other countries too, where they're spending huge amounts on that sort of thing. Secondly, though, in terms of these other crises, such as the climate catastrophe or massive refugee flight from people's homelands, often thanks to the wars that are raging around the world, or sometimes thanks to the collapse of the climate system. All these things cannot be solved by any one nation. That is, this country or that country, country X or country Y, can do a great job, right? They might be really good citizens and help their fellow citizens and curb purchasing fossil fuels. They can admit large numbers of refugees. They can do all kinds of nice things that I think we would all like to see. But these problems are global. They're systemic in terms of the global system. And the only way they can be adequately dealt with is internationally, globally. That is, we're not going to solve the climate crisis by recycling a few bottles in the United States. We're going to have to work with other nations and see to it that around the world there is a massive cutback in terms of greenhouse gases, and that the environment is sustained thereby. And other programs too. If poverty is eradicated in the United States, that would be a fine thing, but that doesn't eradicate poverty in Algeria or in Ethiopia and so on. So really, we're going to have to think globally and not just in terms of our own backyards.
Let me just add to that. Not only do we have to think globally, but we have to think bigger about what the pollution is, including nuclear pollution is radiation. And, you know, there is a movement, the Radiation and Public Health Project, Joe Manganiello, who picked up where Jay Gould left off, who did all those teeth. You know, what was the effect of radiation poisoning that was all over Long Island? Because there was, you know, a test site on Long Island. People were getting sick. And the combination of radiation and cancer and early death, all of it connected to the pollution crisis that we have now that's beyond radiation, but radiation is a central factor.
Thank you. And that relates to another question that came in asking if you could please comment on Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. In particular, the spawning of nuclear power in order to privatize a significant part of the nuclear enterprise and to win public acceptance of nuclear activities. Do you think that selling nuclear power as a solution to climate change is a cover story for military programs?
Well, I'm not sure it's a cover story for them, but it certainly links to military programs. That is developing the fuel. Well, the nuclear power stations develop the fuel for nuclear weapons, and virtually any country that has developed nuclear weapons first has nuclear power plants and then uses that material, that fissionable material, for its nuclear weapons buildup. So they're very directly linked. Eisenhower's speech, which Blanche can talk about, I think, at length, since she's written a great book on Eisenhower's military and foreign policy. But I'll just comment that Eisenhower's speech was delivered in the context of public fears of nuclear war. So in a way, it was designed to head off a criticism of the bomb and to say, well, you know, we, the United States, are now going to lead a campaign for peaceful uses of the atom rather than military warfare uses of the atom. So it had this propaganda value. Blanche.
Well, that's really what my book is about. It's called The Declassified Eisenhower Divided Legacy of Peace and Political Warfare. And political warfare propaganda was a very key element to understanding. I mean, I wrote the book because Eisenhower said he wanted to see World War II be the last civil war to tear humanity apart. Well, we can relate to that. Imagine a president who says he wanted to see World War II be the last civil war to tear humanity apart. And I thought he was a peace activist. That's why I agreed to write this book. However, when I did some research and everything was classified, so we created the Freedom of Information Act, which we still desperately need because so many things are secret and classified ongoing. I found out that it was not the full story, and it's a great tragedy. So there is the military-industrial complex, there is, you know, the economics of it, and then there is all the movements to topple any nation whose politics we don't agree with, like Iran in 1953, and we're still dealing with the legacy of that, and Guatemala in 1954, and on, alas, forever.
Thank you for that, Blanche. We have another question pointing out many people use their vote in the presidential primaries to pressure the Biden administration to do something to stop the genocide in Gaza. In New York State, the presidential primary, 12% voted blank as a protest. What can those against war and nuclear weapons how can they use their vote in November?
Well, I think it's going to be a difficult, well, I think no one should vote for Donald Trump. Clearly, I think he's the most likely politician to use nuclear weapons, given his mental and political instability. Let's put it mildly. But it seems to me that we have to be practical, and therefore I think we're going to have to see to it that the Republican Party doesn't take power congressionally in the Senate as well as in the House, and also in the White House, and that probably means voting Democratic. But in terms of campaigns, we can make our views known. That if we're going to vote for a candidate, we're doing it on this basis. Or we can pressure candidates when they come around to our cities or towns, although unfortunately we're not a swing state, but other people in other states certainly can pressure candidates when they come around and say, what are you going to do about reducing the nuclear menace? What are you going to do about cutting funding for the Pentagon? When do you think you're going to be pressing for support of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and so on? So I think a campaign's a good time to raise the issue when candidates appear. And there will be, of course, candidates in this state who are running for the House and, for the House seats.
In the Senate. I just want to say, I really think pressure on Biden and on Jill Biden, who is really an activist, is very important. I mean, everybody should say to them, where do you stand on these issues? Where do you stand? Speak out. Where do you stand on the UN? They're both supporters of the UN, but they haven't taken a firm stand recently. Historically, they have. And I think that's what we should do.
Thank Thank you, Blanche. Well, one other, could you talk a little bit about those countries that either gave up nuclear weapons or abandoned programs to develop nuclear weapons? There were different results. I'm thinking of South Africa for one, Ukraine for another, but then there was also the example of Libya. Gaddafi agreeing to give up the nuclear weapons program, but was then overthrown anyway. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the popular pressure, as I was suggesting to during my talk, was fairly effective. When we look at the fact that even relatively underdeveloped nations can build nuclear weapons and have, I mean, who would have guessed that a country as impoverished and as economically underdeveloped as North Korea, which can't feed its own people, would have a nuclear weapons program. And poverty didn't stop India from doing it, or Pakistan from doing it. So the fact that there are only 9 nations that have actually developed nuclear weapons out of nearly 200, I think tells us a good deal about the fact that the movement was successful in pressing nations not to do it. And in some cases, politicians said so. The Japanese government certainly had the technological capacity to build nuclear weapons. It had all the technology and scientists and so on. It even had some Japanese scientists working on trying to build nuclear weapons during the Second World War. It was a very, very small project. So in the post-war years, it could easily have built nuclear weapons, and it still might do so. But there was so much protest there that the Japanese government simply backed off and issued non-nuclear declarations. When it came to South Africa, the South African government, of course, secretly developed them. It did have enough technological capacity to do that during the apartheid regime. But what happened was that there was so much protest against South African apartheid and movement for sanctions, which went through, right? Congress passed heavy sanctions against trade with South Africa. And so that was a major struggle in the United States, that the South African government, feeling terribly beleaguered and also taking note of the fact that its nuclear weapons weren't helping them very much, that is, it was facing revolution inside and a tremendous international pressure outside, decided that it could win favor on the world scene by saying, all right, we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons, right? So that too happened to be effective in that regard. I don't know enough about the Libya situation to comment on. I can say though that in West Germany, which like Japan after the war had the technological capacity after it was rebuilding to build nuclear weapons, as well as some very conservative politicians inside the ruling Christian Democratic Party, like Franz Josef Strauss, who looks likely wanted to build nuclear weapons at the time. There was a major campaign in Germany, and the major opposition forces, Social Democrats, made it the centerpiece of their public campaigns. And this created such turmoil in German life that finally the Christian Democrats backed off on building nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Larry. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Blanche? Okay. We have, I think, probably our final question asking about Einstein. He had been a pacifist at an early age, but did the red baiting diminish his stake in influencing the U.S. scientific community and government from his opinions on nuclear war and its impact on humanity?
I didn't follow one word there. Did
Oh.
what
Well,
lead to that?
that Einstein, as a pacifist at an early age, when he was red baited, did that diminish his stake, his ability to influence the U.S. scientific community and the government regarding his opinions on nuclear war and its impact?
Okay. Well, Einstein was by far at the time, throughout his, a good part of his career, including his stay in the United States, he was by far the world's most famous scientist. And what he said mattered. So in this regard, he was the obvious choice for Szilard and others worried about a Nazi bomb project to get President Roosevelt's ear. They felt they couldn't do it, but Einstein, as the great world scientist, could. And that did lead to the Manhattan Project, the nuclear weapons project. But at the same time, Einstein was known as a critic of war. He had come over to collective security, to uniting against fascism after the Nazi rise to power. But he was still a suspect by the U.S. government on those lines. And Einstein was a social democrat, meaning a German socialist. For those two reasons, he was somewhat suspect when it came to security clearance. And J. Edgar Hoover had a huge file on Einstein. Blanche can probably comment on that.
Right.
But
well, he had a huge file on Eleanor Roosevelt.
That's right.
Yeah. But I don't. Yeah. But I don't think it limited Einstein's impact, which was your question.
Oh, well, all right. Let me split that question to two parts. When it came to the government after the building of the bomb, the government, Einstein had no influence, no personal influence on government policy other than warning the president. But he had a major influence on scientists. Again, he was their demigod at that point, and their ticket to fame too. That's why they made him chair of this emergency committee of atomic scientists. So his word counted with the public. When Einstein spoke out publicly, as he often did,
everybody listened.
His words counted for the scientists and for the public, but the government was somewhat worried.
Well, I'll follow up to that. We have a question. In your opinion, is either Einstein or Oppenheimer a good guy?
Well, it depends what
a good guy.
Good. I was implying or stating really that Einstein was much more of a committed campaigner against nuclear weapons than Oppenheimer. At one point, Oppenheimer was concerned about nuclear arms race, and he did speak out against it. But I think Einstein was much more of a crusader and an outsider who was not selling his soul for a government job. Blanche, do you want to comment on?
Well, I think they were both good guys, ultimately, who wanted the world to survive and who came to the point, different times, one world or none. And I think that's really the title of your first volume of the bomb books. I mean, that is it. And it's really what we have to use as a place to build on, a motto to build on and really move forward. And they were both there. Don't you agree? Do you agree, Larry?
Well, I agree that in terms of the post-war period, Oppenheimer was working within channels to try to limit the U.S. nuclear weapons program by not building the H-bomb. And in fact, that's why he was purged from the program. and you know, Truman kicked them off the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission. But Oppenheimer wanted to get back in there once more, and that's when his security clearance was yanked by the federal government. So he really liked power, you know, and in a way he's not a totally appealing figure, and that came through, I think, in the Oppenheimer film.
Power corrupts,
Yes.
and absolute power corrupts, absolutely, yes.
Well, thank you for that, Blanche. Well, I wanted to thank, I think we'll wrap it up now. I wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight. Let you know about another upcoming PANYS event. If you're in the New York City area, this will be an in-person event on the Upper West Side. And Blanche will be there to discuss the re-release of her collection of Crystal Eastman's writings. Crystal Eastman on women and revolution. Now, if you don't know who Crystal Eastman was, and I didn't until a few weeks ago, she was a very influential woman in the early part of the 20th century, was one of the founders of WILT, and has been, you know, has been overlooked. I don't know if you want to say a few words about her, Blanche?
Well, she's responsible for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And she graduated second in her class from NYU Law School when, you know, in the 1900s, when that was very rare for a woman to go to law school. And she's a great, you know, she's a great hero or shiro, and she moves to London and she gets all involved with the British pacifists and the British anti-militarists and the British radicals. So it's a very interesting, wonderful, much needed now story. And she was a rebel girl, you know. So...
Yeah, well, thank you. So we will be getting together for a house party. There'll be some drinks and refreshments, and we'll be talking about Crystal Eastman and learning more about her. That'll be on May 1st. If you want to RSVP, it's bit.ly/NY, I'm sorry, bit.ly is bit.ly/NYCHP. And you'll be getting emails. If any of you are not on our email list, I guess you will be now because we've got your emails. So so do look out for it if you're in the New York City area, and we hope to see you then. And if any of you are new to PANYS, I urge you to become a member tonight. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming, and stay in touch.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.